Oh wow. Really?
Britney Spears.
Kind of, I was going to say it's a bit,
An actual court hanger.
yeah, it's a bit clockwork. Oh God, they're on as well.
Oh yeah, they are.
We good? Okay. Has he pressed it so that does Facebook know we're on and we're live and we're talking? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for coming. The Great Firewall, which is an excuse to talk about the Great Firewall because James Griffiths here is over from Hong Kong where he works for CNN to talk about his new book from Z Books, The Great Firewall of China, which really goes into not just the Great Firewall of China, but all of the dimensions of it across where it's being imposed, Xinjiang and so on. I was just reading the chapter on Xinjiang actually before I came here, which is very good, given that that's a very timely issue for journalists in this country at the moment. So it was an excuse to talk about it and also to invite along Anna Bacciarelli from Amnesty International, who deals with issues around AI and big data at Amnesty International. Obviously, there are now human rights issues around those, and was particularly involved in the issue around Google's Dragonfly project, which was she will explain more, but I will paraphrase, the semi-secret attempt to develop a search engine that would be acceptable in China to allow Google to go into China. So the Great Firewall in its broadest dimensions is our talk today, not just in China, but its extension beyond the borders of China, elsewhere as well, and issues of AI and big data as they play into it, and what's going on with the campaign against Google Dragonfly as well. So what I thought we'd do, I've chaired a lot of events here and I've never been lucky enough to just have 2 people on the panel. I normally have like 3 or 4 people on the panel and a guy from Norway or something up on the screen who kind of maybe hears what we're saying or maybe doesn't. So it's really good to just have 2. So I'm hoping that we can, as they say, kind of deep dive and get a lot deeper into the subject than we might do with the larger panels. And I thought the idea would be that James should talk a little bit about the major theses that come out of his book, and Anna can talk a little bit about her experiences at Amnesty, particularly with Google Dragonfly and other issues around China and big data and so on. I'll ask them a couple of questions that kind of I want to ask them. And then we'll throw it open very quickly. And I'm hoping that, and certainly talking to them both downstairs, I think we shouldn't have a problem, that they're basically going to talk to each other about this and then talk with you about this. So, further ado, James, why don't you give us 10 or so minutes on what's in the book?
Yes, thank you very much, Paul. So the kind of genesis of the book was I was lucky enough to live in China during what we now can see was the high point of Weibo, which is Chinese Twitter, and the high point of this as a kind of free speech platform. And you saw the internet being used, and this is kind of in the early 2010s. You saw the internet being used to affect change in China. One major example was that the internet was a real kind of driving force of bringing attention to air pollution in China and really putting pressure on the government to take action. It also was used to highlight corruption and various other issues. And so I was lucky enough to see kind of the potential power of the internet in China, and then since then, as a reporter, have followed the kind of response to that and the crackdown and the kind of reversal of this as an effective tool for social change. And so the book traces the history of the Great Firewall, and one of the things I discovered in doing the research and in looking at the history is that it has been quite cyclical, with various things coming up that look like they could potentially open up the Chinese internet or have a great effect on how it works, and then having a crackdown, and unfortunately the broader trend is towards ever more censorship and ever more control. And in the past 2 or 3 years, this has also become something that China has begun exporting. So it's built this incredibly sophisticated censorship network in China, which controls the internet more or less absolutely. And now it is increasingly exporting this model overseas, selling the technology and the telecoms infrastructure in order to build firewalls in various countries, and also conducting trainings and giving advice to kind of anyone that wants to, build their own Great Firewall. 2 countries I profile in the book are Russia and Uganda, both of which have very obviously modeled their internet controls in the last few years on China. And the kind of other major argument in the book is that this spread of the firewall and this kind of push towards censorship, both in China and in other countries, is coming at possibly the worst possible time, because it's coming as confidence in the internet generally is perhaps at its lowest point in the history of the technology, and the awareness of problems with the internet is very high, and the risk is that with this, with the kind of traditional model of the internet failing, and I don't think anyone kind of disputes that it's failing, that the most coherent and effective alternative model is the Chinese one. And, this is a model that's attractive not only to autocracies, but also to quite a lot of democracies and quite a lot of, borderline countries around the world. And so, we're potentially at a period in time when, there is a sea change in how the internet operates, not only in China, but also around the world.
That was wonderfully brief. Thank you. Very, very CNN. Now, Anna, please tell us about Dragonfly and your campaign that you revealed.
Yeah. So, kind of going back to your point about regulation. First off, I think that the book does nail 2 huge issues in the tech industry at the minute, and one is the regulation of the internet and state censorship, being at the very far end of that. So as you say, there are many states right now who see China as being in quite an enviable position because they can control the content of these platforms. And, the kind of governance of the internet is a huge issue, from kind of allowing internet access to information, to allowing freedom of expression, but also protecting those rights from harassment, hate speech, targeted discrimination, and so on, and also protecting freedom of opinion. So at Amnesty, we would say that states have to take proactive measures to protect those rights online. So to some extent, we do call for regulation of the internet, and we can see that the kind of libertarian view, as you point out in your book, that started off as a sort of like very American, self-regulatory, comes from a very kind of constitutional approach, that we we'll have this invisible moderator and we'll all be fine, and this is a great space for us all to talk to one another, has descended into something a little bit less favourable. So I think that, talking about regulation right now is the big thing, from like Europe to the States and obviously to China. You can see this as a spectrum. And then secondly, the kind of big theme that I think is key in this is the regulation of the tech companies. And this is obviously a massive issue for us in Europe and, across the world right now. And to this extent, Dragonfly falls under that. So at Amnesty, we talk about corporate actors, including the tech companies, obviously having human rights responsibilities. So the primary burden or duty to protect human rights falls on the states, but then corporate actors have their own responsibilities to respect and protect human rights. And this is well established in the human rights framework. There are due diligence kind of processes that are, bound by international law and standards that companies like Google are supposed to fulfill. And there are many kind of treaties and guiding principles around that. We heard about Dragonfly last summer when it was revealed to Ryan Gallagher at the Intercept by a whistleblower at Google that Google, who had exited China in 2010, were developing a new product, basically a search and news app called Dragonfly, that they wanted to roll out in China. And in order to do that, so the landscape between 2010, when Google exited on human rights grounds, China and Google have changed a lot in the last 9 years, and you've sort of got the Chinese cyber security law that came in 2016, which is basically means that any company operating in China has to comply with strict censorship and surveillance demands, hand over everything to the state for 6 months at a minimum. And then, Google in turn has sort of achieved world domination to some extent. And I think that, we really need to kind of roll back a little bit and see what Google does to lead by example. And going back into China in that environment with everything that Google knows, and bearing in mind its human rights responsibilities, but also, its own policies. It's a company that really kind of, rallies around freedom of expression, protections, and freedom of information. And for them to go back into China in that climate would really set a precedent internationally, and states would be lining up to ask Google to, take down content or hand over information and whatnot. So, we have stalled Dragonfly for now, I think, through an international campaign coordinated with Google employees themselves, many of whom were disgusted at their company's approach to Google, to China, sorry. And also through the human rights community worldwide, including targeted groups, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and so on, who really, they bear the brunt of the Chinese state authorities. So that's where we are in Dragonfly, and that's a bit of an introduction to regulation and human rights.
Okay. To understand what Dragonfly might be, in a way, different from the Google that we see, just quickly, how wide and extensive and what is being censored? I mean, what can I not see on the internet in China that I can see here? What is it that they're censoring?
So there is a huge amount of content and topics which are censored, which are kind of largely obvious to kind of a lot of people. They're kind of the big things like, Taiwanese independence, the Tiananmen Square massacre, and things like that. But the kind of important thing about that is that the purpose of the firewall and the purpose of the censorship is not to kind of block individual pieces of content and topics, though it absolutely does. The most important kind of the key role of it is to prevent organizing around any of these issues. And so, the kind of number one target of censorship in China is collective action, and this can kind of range from, collective action on things like the environment. You'll see quite a lot of discussion about the environment on the internet in China and criticism, but when that tries to move to a stage of state doing a protest or something like that, it will be cracked down upon. Even there was a kind of an app that was very popular for sharing kind of stupid videos and memes that had no political kind of tenor whatsoever, but it grew in popularity so much and it developed this kind of weird cultish following that people were kind of identifying themselves as followers of this app, and they would do meetups around the country, and they would kind of signal to each other and have code words that they used, and that was seen as enough of a kind of separate power base outside the official structure, and even though it's just a stupid app for sharing memes, that it was cracked down upon and it was censored. So a lot of topics are maybe surprisingly discussed on the Chinese internet, but the kind of the taking action on any of those topics is right. The number one thing that's always.
And then we
censored.
don't know where it's coming from. So the Winnie the Pooh thing or something, right? I mean, you can't predict that, right?
No, there's a lot of things that kind of sensitivities that kind of change with the time. Winnie the Pooh is a very good example. That was when Xi Jinping went to the US. There was a photo of him walking next to Obama. Obama's kind of tall and slender. Xi Jinping is still quite tall, but not quite as slender. And it looked, it really did look very much like a kind of image from Winnie the Pooh, of Winnie the Pooh walking with Tigger, and that was shared, and it's now since kind of stuck to Xi Jinping, and they are incredibly sensitive about this topic. It's difficult to tell if this is people kind of proactively protecting their jobs, or if Xi Jinping, for all we know, he might have a sense of humor about this, but the censors definitely don't.
He might, except the V&A's exhibition on the history of Winnie the Pooh and A.A. Milne kind of didn't make it to the new V&A in Shenzhen, did it? And there isn't a great tradition of lampooning politicians.
No.
So that's what we'd get. And one of the things that, it almost seems like a stupid question, I think, but I still want to ask it, because that's what you get to do when you're a moderator, is what is it that Google wants in China, from China? Is it just this old, as Rupert Murdoch used to say, you know, when he was trying to get Sky in there, it's the 2 billion eyeballs thing, right? I mean, is that what they want? Is it about conquering the China market to talk up their stock in Western markets? Is it revenues? I mean, cash? What is it that they want that led them to try and get back in through this process?
Money.
It's
money.
And how would
money
they make
and
that?
data. So, you know, access to the Chinese market would give Google a hell of a lot of data that is currently off limits to them, and very valuable, especially in a big data context. If you're looking at analysis and mapping of people, you know, what they do. And revenue, absolutely. And, you know, they have said to Amnesty many, many times that, oh, we're just kind of scoping, this is only in scoping phase. It is very, you know, Dragonfly was very far along for it just to be in scoping phase. And we know as well that Google are exploring setting up offices in Vietnam at the minute, which has just brought in a new cybersecurity law along the lines of China's. And, you know, they're not doing that to connect people. That's what they'll say, is that we really want to achieve, you know, connectivity and allow people to access information. I mean, using Google isn't going to allow you to access any more information in China than any of the existing apps, you know, if they follow the censorship rules. So, you know, it's not like Google is going in there as some, you know, benevolent offer of information. And I think they did try that. As in fact, you describe it pretty well. And they really tried to sort of show that, you know, they hinted at the censorship. They always had a note saying, you know, you're not getting the full picture, essentially. Right. But, like, they're not planning to do that this time, as far as we would know. And the leadership at Google has changed in that time as well. And, you know, I think that they're clearly pursuing revenue.
I mean, the really interesting thing about Dragonfly was that kind of how, I mean, not open, because this had to be revealed by whistleblowers, but you know, how kind of naked the intentions of the app were, because, you know, this was a completely new app. This was not Google.cn, which was the product that was in China in the 2000s. This was a completely new thing that was designed exclusively for the Chinese market, was, you know, built from the ground up to be a completely different product. And that kind of, you know, shows the lie of, we want to spread our core product to these countries. And, you know, you see other companies, so Facebook's spent a huge amount of effort to try and find a way into China. There have been reports in kind of the last couple of weeks that they may have just finally hit enough walls that they've decided this isn't worth their time. But, you know, the idea that Facebook, as everyone in this room knows it, was ever going to exist in China is a non-starter. You know, Facebook, the product, was never going to exist in China. Facebook, the company, hoped to operate in China and, like you said, suck up huge amounts of data from Chinese consumers and, you know, potential huge amounts of revenue as well. But, you know, the kind of claim that these companies like to make, that they want to, you know, spread their liberatory product around the world and, you know, open people's eyes, and the poor benighted Chinese would be able to use our fabulous search engine and this would, you know, change their lives for the better. That was you were almost able to make that in the 2000s when it was Google.cn, and it was at least the same outward-facing product with restrictions. The, you know, Dragonfly showed that thinking has completely changed, and it seemed to be much more of a kind of naked play for profit.
I mean, they seem to be building it to spec from the Chinese government, you know, or certainly around the cybersecurity laws. So, yeah, I think.
Okay. So I just want to get this straight in my head. I go onto the internet in China and I hit Facebook or Instagram or something, and I get an error 404 message, right? I don't get a message that says the Chinese Communist Party says you cannot look at this, right? I just get an error 404 message, and I don't know if it's, you know, my crappy old Mac that I've been kind of trying to eke out for years, or what it is, or the hotel or whatever, right? That is what Chinese people see when they try and hit things. Still, right? They're seeing just error 404 messages.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important to realize is that most people aren't seeing this because most people don't try and access these services. But I can talk a bit about the kind of structure of the firewall as a piece of technology, and that there are kind of two main parts to it. The kind of and I talk about both, that it happens at a kind of international level and a national level. And the international level is the part of the firewall that is a firewall that kind of works like a home or office firewall, and it inspects traffic as it crosses the borders from the international internet into the national Chinese internet. And that's where things like Twitter, if you type in twitter.com, you send it, it tries to query a server outside, it hits some kind of blacklist and blocks it. But most people don't interact with that because most people don't care about going on Twitter in China, don't care about accessing the international internet. We're speaking in English, so I'm going to assume that most people in this room are, mainly live in the Anglosphere. You probably don't look at that much content outside of the Anglosphere. We happen to have a language that crosses several different countries, but we consume news in this language, and we don't look for.
You might not care. You just
want
your Chinese Kardashians. You want recipes. You want
exactly. And China has a very large kind of English language state media. How many people in this room are checking to see if that state media is publishing stuff the British government doesn't want you to know about goings on in the UK? It's just not a normal behavior. So the really important censorship happens at the national level within China, and that's the stuff that's happening within private technology firms. So Weibo is kind of Chinese Twitter, or WeChat, which it's a product of its own, but it's kind of similar to Chinese Facebook, as it were. It's the main social network, but it's also a messaging app. And so those companies employ thousands of censors and AI and various other tools to prevent people from, accessing banned content and from organizing, as I mentioned earlier. And so, foreigners, I think, interact with the firewall when they're in China, when you and I were in China, that we interact with it very differently to your normal Chinese person.
Yeah. And I mean, my impression of it was always that the internet was seen as different. So if you walk down a Chinese high street, even in a tier 4, tier 5, whatever you want to call a Mao City, there will be, Nike, Adidas, there'll be Buicks and Citroens driving past you. There'll be Western brands, Western products that you understand. Once you go on the Chinese internet, it's like it's almost Western free, right? There isn't anything, right? I mean, apart from going onto Baidu or Weibo or something like that, right? And Kentucky Fried Chicken adverts popping up. I mean, that's about what it is, right? So there's the real world, and then there's the virtual world where Western companies are kind of non-existent, effectively, right? Would I be right in thinking that?
Yeah, and this is interesting because a lot of this is there's a lot of discussion about how much the success of various Chinese companies is to do with the kind of innate protectionism that the Great Firewall provides them. That by blocking Google, by blocking Facebook, you are getting rid of these incredibly successful competitors from the market. And does that enable them to think? Chinese companies push back very, very hard against this claim. But I think you can kind of see some indications of how much that has an impact by how WeChat tried very hard to export it and to get international market share. They have not got very high international market share. Baidu has complete negligible things, and it's it's not particularly popular in China. It's just what you have to use. But then there are also other areas. So a good example of a huge kind of Western company that hasn't necessarily faced the censorship issues is Amazon. Amazon kind of has had other reasons that it hasn't been so successful in China, and the success of Alibaba is kind of much more. Alibaba operates Taobao and is a kind of e-commerce firm which is even as large as Amazon, and the success of that is perhaps much more domestic and genuine, for lack of a better term, than the success of some of the tailored to taste and tailored to the market, and But to go back to Google, I mean, one of the kind of constant, complaints and the attacks that were made against Google when it operated in China was that this is a foreign company and they don't know and they don't understand China and they don't understand. All of the people running Google.cn were Chinese. They were all recruited from Chinese tech firms and were, at least as familiar with the market as their competitors at Baidu. The reason Google failed at that time was to do with the firewall and was to do with other issues. And
in terms of going to Anna's area of big data gathering and what they're doing out there, I mean, the WeChat thing is incredible. I mean, if you go to China, 99% of communications I have with China now are WeChat communications, whether it's outside or inside, right? I mean, the way I hire my bike in Beijing to cycle up the road, the way I pay for my taxi, the way I shop everywhere when I'm there is through a WeChat wallet, right? I mean, from the moment I set foot in China, and even when I'm outside China, a vast amount of data is being gathered on me, right? I mean, I'm interested in what Anna thinks about that. But first of all, could you give us an idea? How did WeChat become like this? How did WeChat become like this completely dominant part of Chinese life, to the point that even watermelon sellers on the street, or people who sell flowers on the street, will, with the QR codes and everything.
The buskers not have a WeChat.
Yes, buskers.
Yeah.
No, actually, interestingly, I saw a busker on my way from Oxford Circus today who had a tap card, contactless payment system.
Hopefully they're going to do that.
Spreading to the UK.
We're not going to get left behind. Yeah.
But no, I mean, WeChat kind of has had huge success. Both organically, genuine kind of just very good innovation.
Because it's good.
It's okay.
The phone service, the talking over it and everything is good.
It is one of the most bloated apps in the world. It makes iTunes look streamlined and incredible.
It does eat up your data.
But, this is successful. It was launched and promoted and built by Tencent, which is a huge Chinese tech firm, and was a very successful tech firm at the time, and was able to do what Facebook has done in the West and buy up a lot of its competitors and wrap them into its platform and stuff. So WeChat was kind of from the get-go the 300-pound gorilla in the room that was eating up its competitors. But also, I think what is sometimes overlooked in this is, or at least personally, I've always thought that WeChat and other kind of things like when we talk about contactless payments and things like that, it maybe gets too much credit, and the Chinese market and the Chinese consumer base doesn't get enough credit for being responsive and agile and keen to use this technology, because it exists in quite a lot of countries, and it has not spread. I mean, I live in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is useless. We have just got really the spread of contactless payments and stuff, and these systems are around forever. Hong Kong prides itself on being a kind of modern city, and there was nowhere near the same amount of kind of merchant pickup and of consumer pickup as well. China was kind of poised and ready to jump on this technological innovation, and WeChat kind of surfed that to dominance.
Okay. But they know everything, right? Yeah,
they do. And to be honest, I don't think it's particularly different from our experience of using our phones and the internet here.
My chip and pin? That's as bad?
Well, I think the real concern in China, or certainly from Amnesty's perspective, is the jurisdiction that it is based in and the laws that go along with that. So the cybersecurity law that then, the state has not only a stake in WeChat and Tencent and so on, but they so they can see that information freely. But then we know that they take punitive measures against human rights activists, journalists, lawyers, blah blah blah. And we also know that they store the data and then use that for later. Kind of the kind of freedom of association is certainly, like I think you mentioned earlier that a journalist is really going to struggle with the new social credit system, for example, through their WeChat connections, just by freedom of association.
You've raised it. Can we just explain what the social credit system is? Because that is really fundamental to this now,
right? I'll go into social credit, but just to kind of use an anecdote to kind of talk about WeChat as kind of the potential dangers of it. I have a couple of chapters in the book focusing on the Tibetan diaspora and Dharamsala and around the Dalai Lama, and I focused on them because they were continue to be the number one target of China's hackers, and have been hugely surveilled and targeted for decades. And what was really interesting is that there was a drop. It used to be a thing where everyone in the community would be targeted, because if even if you aren't the kind of key person who knows loads of information about the Dalai Lama, you're probably only a couple of degrees removed. And if you can then get targeted, you can then use that person to get to the next person and kind of roll it up as if it's a kind of, mafia investigation by the police. And that analysts and human rights experts used to be able to see this, and we'd be able to see it. And then suddenly there was this big drop-off. And what my reporting done, a lot of kind of Tibetan cybersecurity experts said that drop-off coincides with the spread of WeChat to the diaspora. Because if you're in the diaspora and you want to talk to your relatives back in Tibet, they're all on WeChat and there's no real other way of talking to them. And that means that everyone starts using WeChat, and that means that you don't need to hack people to get this data. You just send a request to Tencent and you get it, in a much easier way. And so that kind of shows how potentially, just how effective this app is from the government's perspective, and how dangerous it is from kind of anyone that wants to use it in a way that the government doesn't particularly approve of. But I can talk a bit about
the ongoing
social credit.
rollout of the social credit system, I think, is like the next level of this thing that we kind of have to think about, right?
Yeah, so the social credit system is, it's important to point out, it's at the moment is a theoretical system. There are a couple of pilot programs in place around the country, but, this is quite easy to explain to people because there literally was a Black Mirror episode about this before it kind of was widely popular in a thing, and it's basically the Black Mirror episode where you have a score that can be affected by a huge range of behavior. So some of the systems that are in place are around travel, because there have been issues in the past with kind of misbehavior by kind of Chinese tourists on planes and things like that have led to flights being grounded and things like that. And so those people now are hit with a kind of travel ban that can mean they just literally can't take planes around the country, and that literally happens in the Black Mirror episode. The woman can't travel. As the system gets rolled out, or as it's intended to work, this will also then kind of cover a lot of other behavior. So, kind of antisocial behavior generally could affect one's social credit score. Organizing online and doing things that get you censored could affect the social credit score. And that's kind of scary enough when it comes to how you as the individual behaves. But what's really kind of potentially nefarious about this, and potentially even more concerning, is that the associations that you have can also be affected by your social credit score, and can also, so if you are kind of some Gen Z teenager who wants to push the bucket on Weibo and post things that are controversial and complain about the government, and you get punished by your social credit score lowering, that could also potentially have an effect on your parents' social credit score. It could mess up your father's business, mess up your mum's social life, because no one wants to associate with her because she's got a terrible social credit score. And we were talking earlier, and I've kind of expressed concerns to colleagues who live on the mainland that I at least think that being a journalist under the social credit system is going to be incredibly difficult, and it's difficult enough already to get people to talk to you in China, and it has got significantly worse in just the last 2 years. But it's not hard to imagine a system where having a journalist's phone number in your phone could affect your social credit score. I think we should expect every journalist in China to have a terrible social credit score, and association with them will then affect you. So why would you associate with them? Why would you go anywhere near anyone the moment they say BBC or NPR? You run a mile because you don't want to have them in your WeChat. You don't want to have them mess up your social credit. So this is a system of control that is incredibly, potentially, it is theorized, but is potentially incredibly sophisticated and could have, a huge ripple effect well beyond, just the kind of day-to-day behavior.
Well, I think it really shows how online spaces can, in the spread of online spaces in our lives, right? I know all of us carry a phone around, we use it now to get on public transport. Every little part of my day usually has something to do with my phone, and that has just opened up a whole world of opportunity for state authorities who really want to make the most of that and use it for punitive measures.
Have you at Amnesty, obviously you're starting to look at this, and it's have you seen anything like this anywhere else, though, the social credit system, anything even remotely on this scale?
I think China is always an absolute extreme example, like when you're looking at censorship, and then also the sort of scoring of individuals and mass discrimination in Xinjiang, and all of these activities are absolutely at an extreme. We do see databases like this being used by state authorities across the US. Machine learning systems being introduced into much of like policing, criminal justice systems, and so on, to allocate risk scores to individuals and kind of try and predict where they, may be at risk of offending and so on, and those people are treated differently. And there are lots of racial biases and social biases that are embedded into code there, and then absolutely in the UK. So yeah, I've mentioned that at Amnesty we conducted some research last year that showed the UK, the London, Met Police has this gangs database, a gang nominal database, where they basically ascribe a risk score to young men ordinarily to do with their interaction with any criminal gangs. There's not often a criminal element, so it could be from videos that someone watched on YouTube, they listen to grime music, they hang out with certain people, they lived in a certain estate, and so on. And this information was being collected by the Met Police, plugged into a database, and then that risk score that's automated follows that person around for the rest of their life. And there's no easy way to get off the gangs database, and that information is then shared with local authorities, so your access to housing, education, employment, is all impacted by that, and it follows you around. There's no way to get off. That database, since we've raised concerns about it, has now been paused, which is great, and it's being investigated by the mayor. But it really shows that I think China is often sort of otherized, and it's really seen as like, well, that's crazy. But actually, a lot of these behaviours and systems are, part of many different societies, including our own. And I don't think that the otherizing helps in terms of like understanding the situation there and our own society.
One of the
Go on, no,
sorry,
please.
but one of the questions I had at previous events and stuff, and is quite kind of very fair question that I don't have a super great answer for, is what can be done about the situation in China, what can be done about the firewall, what can be done the kind of only really solid answer I have is to build the best possible system in your own country. And I think there has been, because of the extremes that one can point to in China, or in several other countries as well, that's enabled governments in democracies and governments in the West to take take quite a lot of freedoms online away, or certainly to infringe upon them, and there hasn't been as much consciousness and the need to push back against this, and the need to kind of build a new system and push towards openness and kind of freedom that having you can't fix the situation in China if we don't fix the internet at home, and if we kind of quietly allow the internet at home to become not quite as bad as China, but 70% of the way there, then there's kind of no hope for anywhere really.
Thanks
to be super positive.
You thought you were getting
book
away
is more,
from
the book is
Parliament
more
this evening
enjoyable
to come
than
and talk
that.
about something different. One more question, and then we'll go to the audience. So also, there's layers of firewall, right? So we're talking about a firewall around China that obviously means that you can't see certain things like that. If we go to, for instance, Xinjiang, which is a big news story at the moment, which people have been looking at with the internment camps and so on, there we have almost total blackout at times, right? And in Tibet as well. So that is a very sophisticated level, right? Isn't it? I mean, what has happened in Xinjiang with what I'm calling it total blackouts? I don't know if that's quite correct.
Yeah, it's kind of sophisticated and very unsophisticated at the same time, because so the blackout in Xinjiang happened in 2009. There were protests which became riots in Urumqi, the capital of the province. The response to that was to completely cut off the entire province, which is huge and has a population of in the tens of millions. completely cut off that entire province from the internet, from long distance phone calls, and from text messaging for quite a long time. The internet blackout lasted for 10 months and was complete for quite a long time. You know that there was eventually you got state media again because people can't live without reading the People's Daily, and
obviously.
they were given that. But it had a huge effect on people's lives. Obviously, anyone that ran an internet cafe immediately went out of business. But also, people were trekking to the neighboring provinces. And Xinjiang, if people don't know the geography of China, is not a very well connected province. It's in the far northwest, and it's it's quite difficult to get. It's a long train journey or a plane journey to get to your next province, and that was the ability to do that is because of China's sophisticated control over how the internet, how the kind of technology of the internet operates in China. There's control of the telecoms firms, there's control of the backbone which runs it all. But as a approach, it was it's a pretty blunt object to just cut off the internet. That has been used in other parts of China since at a provincial level and at a county level and smaller levels to kind of when there are large workers' protests or things like that. It's a good way of kind of putting a lid on them. China generally doesn't have to use this as a tactic too much because of the kind of much more sophisticated system that's in place. This tactic has been exported incredibly heavily, and there is, just this year we've already seen major internet blackouts in the DRC, in Zimbabwe, in quite a few other countries in Africa. India has very regular internet blackouts in parts of it, particularly in places like Kashmir. And this is a very it's a bit of a nuclear option of internet censorship, but it's effective in terms of preventing people from organising and stopping a protest in its tracks if that protest is being organised online. And it's
how else do you organise a protest now, right?
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting. I was talking last night to someone about the fact that kind of the most effective group of people in China that in terms of organising. That aren't as affected by the internet restrictions as others are the workers' movement in China, because it's older. There is much more of a kind of base of knowledge about leaflets and about traditional organising.
Old school.
Your kind of younger protesters, student protesters lack, and I'm absolutely in that demographic as well. I would have no idea how to organise a protest without. Making a group on Facebook, basically. What else do you do?
You don't know how to use a Gestetner and just turn that leaflet off, calling against cuts in the history department. No, you don't know how to do that. Yeah. Okay. And for Amnesty, I mean, I know it's not quite perhaps your bailiwick, but Xinjiang is big on your radar at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I do it. There's like millions interned and re-educated. It's absolutely a huge issue for Amnesty, and we don't have much access to the region, which is problematic. I mean, that's problematic in general, and in terms of reporting on what's happening in Xinjiang as well. So, yeah.
Okay.
Actually, it's worth saying though that Xinjiang is a real example of how not to use artificial intelligence. Technology.
Explain.
So facial recognition, for example, is being used widely to target people based on their ethnicity and their face. So outside mosques and so on, you'll get facial recognition cameras that are kind of intriguingly designed to look like the sort of call to prayer speakers. I think there's an interesting design element there, but you couldn't claim that it's not targeted discrimination in that circumstance. It's very highly sort of there's a lot of tech involved, and they're really kind of using the automated systems available to them to discriminate en masse.
And Xinjiang's also has long been a kind of testing ground for various securitization principles and methods, and we've seen them spread out into other parts of China. We're already seeing this technology spread out into other parts of China, and from a kind of non-Chinese perspective, just broadly international perspective, it is also being exported to other countries. This is private industry in China which is developing this technology. They are now, as a couple of them are valued in the billions of dollars. They are very actively selling this tech to countries all over the world.
Like Zimbabwe.
Like
So,
Zimbabwe.
so they've sold it to the state authorities in Zimbabwe and are now the Zimbabwe authorities want to build a facial recognition database of all of their citizens, and they're using Chinese technology. I've seen reported that the Chinese machine learning systems, certainly for their facial recognition tech, are very well trained on Asian faces. They don't have many black faces for their training data. So, but I mean, there's a data sharing agreement then between the Zimbabwe government and the Chinese authorities. It's extremely problematic.
Okay, sorry, I've gone on asking questions for a long time. Do we have to move a microphone around? Okay, so gentleman over here was out of the traps pretty quick.
Thank you all very much. Very intriguing. A bit, if not a bit depressing. The names Ewan Grant. I've got on my phone a photo of a very brave young man who's undergone 2 liver transplants. The second liver transplant was a very expensive operation carried out in China. I think you can guess the source of the donor liver. Mike, 3 very quick questions. One, in view of what you've all said, should people who believe that Huawei is not a security risk in the West be offered psychiatric treatment? And secondly, particularly for Mr. Griffith, given that you're working in Hong Kong, do you see signs, and that you've hinted at it in what you've been saying, of self-censorship in mainland, well, there we are, but also among your Hong Kong and Chinese colleagues working with you in CNN and other international media in Hong Kong? I very much hope you'll both be back in a year or two's time to see what is developing in all this in Africa, because I think that's very, very worrying. And for Ms. Bartelli, is it really, quite frankly, for organizations like Amnesty, is it really game over in China, and it has to be done at arm's length from neighboring countries? Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna park the Huawei thing for a minute, because it's like that's a hornet's nest that is important, but not, it's tangential to an extent. But Hong Kong.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about Hong Kong
and of course, whether, the question on Amnesty. So should we take Hong Kong?
Hong Kong and self-censorship in general. I mean, we talked, everything we've kind of talked about so far has to a large degree been about kind of top-down censorship and then the kind of active censorship. Of course, the amounts of self-censorship, is difficult to measure, but is probably larger. The when you operate in a system that you know to be censored, that you know that can have potential repercussions for posting things that are potentially might breach certain laws, you more often than not don't. You don't either because you're scared or just because there's no point. If the post is going to get deleted in 5 minutes, you may as well watch TV. Why do it? And that's definitely a huge issue. There's we know that a lot of there has been a huge brain drain from the domestic Chinese press, which has been very good at times and has a kind of long history of a good pedigree of investigative journalism within a very confined system. But there's been a big brain drain in recent years of young journalist students and young people in general just not going into journalism because of the kind of pressures on it within China are so great that again, why would you put yourself through that and potentially put your family through it? In Hong Kong, the system is the situation is different but similar, and there are serious concerns about self-censorship that have been around for a long time. A lot of Hong Kong media, domestic media, is owned by either Chinese nationals directly or Chinese-linked companies. The SCMP, the biggest English language newspaper in Hong Kong, is owned by Alibaba. We don't have any evidence of kind of Alibaba taking direct action, but it's very easy to imagine being particularly a young employee in one of these companies, you might be concerned that this is going to cost you your career if you step over some invisible red line. What's got worse in recent years in Hong Kong is there has been significant escalation in kind of prosecution of protesters, prosecution based on political speech, and last year we had the first ever foreign journalist, Victor Mallet from the Financial Times, was denied a visa to work in Hong Kong after he hosted an event at the Foreign Correspondents Club where he hosted an independence activist. An independence activist that I might say me and many of my colleagues have interviewed, so this was, is a direct concern. And what's interesting perhaps in the Hong Kong context more so than China is that I personally believe the risk of self-censorship in Hong Kong is higher than China, because once the potential costs of angering the government or stepping over these red lines becomes similar to it is in China, so journalists quite often get refused visas in China, or ejected, but most people go into the country aware of that and not necessarily intending to stay for decades. Hong Kong's very different. People get permanent residency, they put their kids in school in Hong Kong, they spend their entire lives in Hong Kong. So the potential for general self-censorship in media organizations there is potentially higher because the costs are higher, and the type of people that are making these decisions are perhaps a different character to the people that are making them in that are correspondents in Beijing.
An Amnesty
Amnesty
UK
in
member?
China. I mean, we will always document human rights abuses worldwide wherever they are happening, and I don't think we would, stop just because we don't see the Chinese state authorities changing anytime soon. I mean, who knows? Maybe there will be a change in authority, and there'll be some kind of justice for the victims and accountability. I know, but we need to give a picture of human rights abuses around the world, and I also think that showing what is happening in China, not all of it absolutely negative. So I would say that there are sort of consumer protections that have come in China recently that actually kind of mirror the GDPR in many ways. They may not come from a human rights basis, but they still show that people have a right to consumer privacy. Of course, when you set that against the cybersecurity law, it's sort of effectively meaningless. When you've got mass state surveillance and censorship, but it's not a sort of black and white picture. And I also think that pointing to how China is using artificial intelligence and machine learning in particular is a useful red flag to many other states.
Okay, we have another question. Well, let's go have the lady down here and there's a gentleman there afterwards.
When did the social credit system come in? I don't know if you said, I didn't hear. And I also wanted to ask, how much do they monitor their citizens who are in Western countries, for example, as students or living as workers, say in Britain, and going back sometimes? I wondered how much they were monitored. And then the other thing that struck me was I've been to meetings here before, like there was one about Hungary quite recently, and the Hungarian ambassador was invited and quite dominated the conversation, in fact. And I just wondered if, I don't know how much you had to do with choosing the panel, whether there'd been ever any thought of having a Chinese representative, as it were, on the panel, and whether you think that would be completely impossible. I thought it would be impossible with the Hungarians, but there he was. I just crossed my mind listening to you.
I think we'd have to ask Frontline for the last one, because I wasn't involved anyway. But to address your first question, the social credit system is not in place yet. There are a couple of pilot programs. It's not in place, no. There are a couple of pilot programs around the country that are being tested. There are a couple of kind of related systems that are vaguely underway. But the kind of overarching system, the one that's been proposed and is kind of rolling through various government steps, it is still in the works. The kind of the timeline for introducing it is quite rapid. It's only a few years away, but it remains to be seen if it will be introduced that quickly, because it is hugely complex. Even if you don't care about the human rights side of it, it's hugely complex to institute. Your second question about kind of control of people overseas, that's been a very kind of interesting development in recent years. There used to be, not that kind of China's control stopped at the border, but there used to be less concern about, I think, how people acted overseas, and less concern generally about how people thought about China overseas. To give one example that is related to internet censorship is there has been for years a kind of an active Chinese community on Twitter, despite it being banned in China. People use VPNs and various other circumvention tools to get to Twitter and post on Twitter. A lot of them are dissidents or otherwise critical of the government. That had kind of been tolerated because I think the government realized that they were something of an echo chamber. They were talking to each other. Twitter's blocked in China, so it wasn't like it was getting back in. That's completely changed in the last 12 months, and people have spoken to journalists and spoken to human rights researchers and said that they have had visits from the police and been told to delete their Twitter accounts. The pressure has changed. So the tolerance for kind of misbehavior overseas or misbehavior in an international forum is shrinking, and this is particularly concerning, I think, for Chinese students who the success of Chinese students overseas. They're one of the largest kind of bodies of international students. There is a reason people want to go and study overseas. It's great, and it's really kind of a positive thing for China to have this kind of international link. And we have quite a lot of reporting on increasing involvement of embassies and consulates in putting pressure on student organizations, in kind of having quiet words with student leaders and stuff about their fellows, and the ability to escape China as a Chinese person is perhaps shrinking.
Anna, do you have
I don't have anything else.
Okay. Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Yeah, I have some friends in Shanghai and in Beijing, and we communicate very openly, and I use loaded words all the time to see if they'll be stopped for some reason. But when they need the full internet, they just use VPNs, and there are lots of providers of VPN. It would seem to me that if this is something that concerns us all, we could be making donations to VPN suppliers to just make them available and have them rotated through, and that would actually solve much of the problem for people who need to be connected.
Yeah, I mean, the problem
Sorry,
is...
James, can you give us an idea? Do you have any idea of how many people are using a VPN?
In China?
Yeah.
There isn't a good kind of recent number, but we know from kind of previous studies that it's kind of between 1% and 5%. 5% is probably the absolute top, and it's China, so 5% of the population is a lot of people, but it's 5%, and potentially it's much lower. It could be closer to 1%, which is still a lot of people. But what's important to think about with VPNs and with other circumvention tools, and that there are ways to get past the firewall. The firewall isn't 100% effective. There are holes. VPNs is kind of one of the bigger ones, and I use VPN whenever I'm in China. Colleagues. The problem is they can be stopped 100% when the government needs to, because they can be blocked at a protocol level and controlled at that level. Someone who was reviewing the book messaged me after she'd finally got her review sent, and to tell me that she's based in Beijing, and she had to send the review by text messages through Signal to one of her colleagues in Hong Kong, who then sent it to the book's editor in London, because she had all 4 of her VPNs didn't work, because I don't know if people are aware, but it's National People's Congress, the Chinese Parliament session is in Beijing at the moment, so it's a sensitive period. And at sensitive periods, the government has shown its ability to block VPNs entirely. The reason it doesn't do that all the time is because VPNs as a technology are used for multiple other purposes a lot by businesses. Banks get very annoyed when you block VPNs because it has security issues. Embassies as well also get very annoyed. So there is a kind of, the government is forced to a certain degree of tolerance to that. Private VPN companies face a different challenge, which is, in order to sell your VPN services, you have to have a degree of, you have to be public facing, because obviously how are you going to find consumers? The problem is the moment you're public facing, you're also, censor facing, and so the censors are able to monitor things. And I've talked to lots of people who work within VPN companies, and they describe it as a cat and mouse game, that they are constantly trying to stay a step ahead of the government. We're quite lucky that a lot of people that go into that sphere are very kind of focused on privacy, focused on anti-censorship. They quite enjoy it, but and it gives them, I think, gives them a sense of purpose, and it's definitely a very valuable service that they provide. It is very resource heavy and it's expensive, and and then another point on VPNs I would make is that those private VPNs generally are much more effective for foreigners who have access to the open internet than they are for Chinese people, because you can't get to the service to download the VPN tool to begin with. Even if you can, you potentially don't want that credit card record that's going to connect you to this company, which will show that you're breaking the law. And even if you pass those two steps, we've seen increasingly, this is one of the things that started in Xinjiang and it's now spreading out elsewhere. Police, when they do kind of ID checks and stuff, they now increasingly look at people's phones, swipe through your phone, have a look at your apps. What's this VPN app on your phone? Let's maybe have a closer look at your phone. What else are you doing? So the potential costs for having it are much higher, and yeah.
So I was going to say, for me, VPNs seem to be like another example of sort of Chinese pragmatism in the way that, we went through this with Bloomberg terminals and things like this, which is you don't want people necessarily accessing all the information that was on a Bloomberg terminal any more than you want people accessing everything. But there are hedge funds and people in Shanghai and Beijing, Chinese hedge funds and things, who need the global world of information in order to you cannot run a successful hedge fund off of the People's Daily and the China Daily, right? You're going to make some very big, costly errors, right, if you do that. So there's a certain pragmatism to VPNs that mean that these guys need it. And, you would get nowhere if you shut off JP Morgan's Beijing VPN that allows them to access all the data that they need to make the decisions that they make. Right?
Yeah, one potential development in this area is, and it remains to be seen if this is ever kind of brought into practice, but there has been talk of licensing VPNs in China so that you would have a VPN that offers the things that a VPN does. So I'm sure most people in this room are familiar with using a VPN to connect to a work network to get your email, or your university network to get your email and stuff. And so it would enable you to do that, but wouldn't open up the rest of the internet. And I think there are massive kind of stumbling blocks for that technology, mainly to be, would anyone want to use a VPN that is officially sanctioned and licensed to them by the Chinese government? There are awful lot of other concerns with that, especially if you're a bank or a big business. But this is potentially a way that they can finally kind of solve this problem that is definitely an issue for them.
Okay. Shall we move over to a gentleman here and a gentleman there? One here, the glasses. Sorry, I was trying to think what was.
I just actually one very quick point, Paul. You mentioned most of the foreign social media companies are obviously not accessible in China. And the one exception, I suppose, significantly is LinkedIn, which has its nice Chinese name but also filters out content, doesn't it? Because you occasionally get a message saying this post cannot be seen in the People's Republic of China, but other people will be able to see it. But anyway, the one point.
And LinkedIn has recently enforced, at the request of the state authorities in China, a connection with your phone number. So you have to give your personal phone number over when you can.
Right. So just quickly following up on VPNs. There's been a couple of cases, I think, in recent months where people have been either fined or possibly in one case jailed for using a VPN. Yeah. And is that the thin end of a wedge where they may really start cracking down harder, on Chinese users? Because there's been talk about this over the years. Some occasionally people in universities will say, "Oh, we've been told not to use VPNs," whereas some people were pretty much told they should use them because it's the only way to get access to lots of things. So that's one question. And then just more generally, who do you think is really driving Chinese central government policy on the internet now? We've had various people like Lu Wei, who was seen as the internet Tsar, who suddenly came to a sticky end. But is there a brains behind this, if that's the right phrase? Thank you.
Yeah, to touch briefly on the VPN issue, that the tolerance for VPNs has gone basically. This was not technically illegal for a very long time, and then laws were passed to make it illegal. Those laws are now being enforced. Someone was jailed, and I think a couple of people have been jailed now. That's also indicative of the fact that most of the VPNs that kind of Chinese people were using were not the private VPNs that advertise widely. They're kind of quiet ones that people set up and stuff, and so it is law enforcement is looking into it, and they're trying to crack down on this. In terms of policy, it is kind of from a storytelling perspective, it's quite disappointing that Lu Wei, who was this very flamboyant, outspoken internet czar in China for many years, he came across a corruption investigation last year and has had a very rapid downfall, as people tend to have the moment a corruption investigation starts. It's slightly difficult to tell at this stage. He has kind of replacements at a title level, but they don't seem to have the same influence as him. But I think what we can say with reasonable confidence is that this is a priority of Xi Jinping's. Xi Jinping has spoken multiple times. He spoke at the Weijin Internet Conference a couple of years ago about cyber sovereignty. He started various task force. I think one of his millions of titles that he has at this point is related to internet governance and things like that. This is clearly something that he is personally invested in advancing. Whoever, presumably it gets handed off to someone underneath him, but part of the problem with talking about China is how untransparent this system is.
I mean, the point in the way I was wondering about is, they obviously have some quite smart people who actually really understand the internet working on it. So, are they siphoning off people from top universities to work in these government policy areas?
I think so, and there's lots of people within the party, that you can see this, so the kind of the modern system of cyber sovereignty and the current kind of things that have been put into action. We can trace them back through various party journals and think tanks, and see this being developed. Just as kind of policy in the UK is kind of sometimes bubbles out of think tanks. These party-related think tanks are focusing very heavily on these issues, and both inside the particular part of the party and also inside the PLA as well, the People's Liberation Army. There is a huge amount of focus and of talent looking at this.
Gentleman in the black jacket. Yeah. Well, there's lots of hands now.
Very quick question, effectively. I was wondering what the role the firewall and digital infrastructure and all that stuff plays in the Belt and Road Initiative, which is obviously Xi Jinping's the jewel in his crown and all that.
Yeah, slightly fading jewel at the moment, but I talked a bit about the kind of the technology behind the firewall, and the thinking behind it is being exported. It's been exported kind of around the world, but it is also being kind of exported very heavily to Belt and Road countries. I mean, it's a bit difficult to link them directly because there's so many countries are in the Belt and Road thing that is it correlation or causation there? But it does play a role. Various securitization policies, such as the situation in Xinjiang, there is a degree of kind of relation from that to Belt and Road. A desire to kind of have Xinjiang completely controlled is part. We can assume it is partly due to the fact that a lot of Belt and Road kind of trade is potentially going to come through that area. So it's definitely related. How much of a driver it is difficult to tell.
Anna, you mentioned Zimbabwe. Do you guys have a hit list of countries that are on that Belt and Road, Central Asia, Africa, that are most susceptible and really want this stuff?
I think you could point to many of the African states, to be honest. I know that Kenya has just brought in a new a really wide scoping sort of biometric law registration of every person, every citizen, refugee person in Kenya, including like DNA, blood samples, geolocation, and so. I mean, to me, that looks straight out of the box from Xinjiang. Right. So, yeah, I don't know to what extent they are using Chinese infrastructure, but I do know that there is infrastructure across African states, and also nearby. Like Cambodia is now like the hardware is Chinese, and Vietnam, is this kind of building of hardware, but then also the policy as well, as it seems to follow.
Okay. We've got room for a couple more. There was a lady here and a gentleman here. So let's do that. Let's see how we go.
I just want to, I've heard a lot about the internet censorship and surveillance of the Chinese government on Chinese citizens, and also the situation in Xinjiang. So it's becoming really worrying and disturbing. But the thing is, what can we do? Because the problem is China now technically is quite advanced, and also is such a big country with a very strong government. So what can be done to stop this, or to improve the situation a bit? Because otherwise, not only does it impact Chinese people, but also it will have impact on people outside China as well. So what kind of suggestions can you have?
I think states could be doing a lot more proactively. I haven't seen this hugely raised in international sort of intergovernmental forums. I mean, for a start, like, my area is looking at tech and tech companies, and I would warn them off going into, to kind of set an example and not do not follow through with those censorship and surveillance demands. But I think the primary sort of leadership really should come from other states.
Have we said anything about this, or is this going to just piss on our golden age or whatever it is with the Chinese at the moment, that we wouldn't raise anything like that?
The UK?
The UK, yeah. Such as it remains. It may have ended. The UK may actually have ended while we're having this meeting. I don't know, but yeah. But I mean, do we have any? Have we made? Has anyone made any comment on this at all? Yeah, we haven't. Okay. Yeah.
And to be a kind of negative voice, which I'm sorry for being quite pessimistic and negative in this regard, but one of the things that I talk a lot about in the book, and that I come across a lot in my reporting, is unfortunately how either ineffective or counterproductive foreign state involvement is in this regard. So especially when it comes to the internet, the US funds quite a lot of, less so than they used to, but funds quite a lot of internet freedom initiatives through things like the National Endowment for Democracy, through USAID and things like that. The problem is that the moment you have US funding, it's very easy for the Chinese state to paint you as a suspicious actor. And beyond that, the moment anyone in your sphere has US funding, it's very easy for the Chinese state to paint you as a suspicious foreign actor. And, that has led to kind of quite, that's kind of really kind of seen some regression in China because of this. I found and I quote in the book, I found a WikiLeaks cable from around the time that Google was leaving, and it was, it was an academic talking to political officers at the embassy in Beijing, the US embassy in Beijing, and was desperately telling them, don't make this a US versus China issue, because the words he used was, the moment you turn this into a battleground, China will militarize it and will control this much more heavily. So it's a very, very difficult balance. It's a very difficult kind of road to tread. Of, we want foreign governments to use what influence they can on China, but we don't want them to do it in a way that results in a kind of more negative reaction or potentially justifies the controls that are already in place, or justifies escalating those controls.
I think one sort of sideways approach that we found through Amnesty is through China's influence abroad. So particularly in the sort of mining industry in African states, we're trying to kind of just sort of nudge them on the exports and their kind of sort of foreign investments to make that human rights compliant, and then you can sort of nudge bit by bit, and that's been for us, as far as I'm aware, like the most successful sort of influence method there.
Okay, look, you guys are great. You're cracking through these questions, and everyone's been asking very succinct questions as well. Sir?
I'll try and be better.
Yeah.
Ish. At what point do you think that other states would actually intervene with the proliferation of the technology which enables the censorship and the crackdown on rights? Because if they're willing to just carry on, surely that means that it will just carry on spreading and thus becomes harder.
I would argue that that's already happened. The technology. Sorry, I'm really negative. The source of joy. You know, you thought you were all escaping.
Welcome back to Britain.
Welcome back to Britain. Yeah. You know, this technology has spread to a lot of countries already. And more so than the technology, the thinking behind it, and the knowledge base, and the kind of the ability to conduct trainings for government officials from any country in the world. That stuff is how do you control it? Potentially, we could see, we perhaps should see more being done by Western governments to pressure countries that are kind of, that they do have some influence over, not to go down this road. I think we should kind of, people that live in democracies around the world should be kind of conscious of when their governments do this, because a lot of the countries in Africa that are going down this route are democracies. There is a potential way for people to exercise influence on the government that there isn't in a lot of other countries. And so, it is spreading. What can be done about it? Potentially something can be done, but it's been spreading for a couple of years now, and not much has been done. I don't think I don't think this is near the top of the agenda for a lot of countries that perhaps could be involved in this area.
Well, to that end, do you believe that with the current troubles that other countries are having, that they might go down this route of censorship and building up the technology to try and combat it, but then inadvertently go down the Chinese model fully without realizing it?
I don't think you could do that accidentally. But yes, yeah. I think we've seen this in this country, right? When you have security services, but by dint of being a security service, or by dint of even being like something like the police, you tend to move in the direction of greater powers and control, because it makes your jobs easier, it makes things, and governments act in the same way. You need kind of civil society, or you need politicians within a democracy to push back against this, and to say, actually, yes, I know it would be easier to catch terrorists if we had the social credit system in the UK, but we don't want that. We're willing to make a compromise.
What gentleman means is, could you think you're doing a good thing, but end up doing a bad thing?
Mass surveillance has never stopped terrorist attack. So
and I'm perhaps cynical that these people think they're doing a good thing, and rather than they are kind of consciously taking advantage of a situation to increase their power.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes left. I know this gentleman's been jumping in, and I'm sorry. So you're going to be the last one, so make it a good one.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit around the fuzzier side of censorship. So I'm thinking about kind of thematic censorship and entertainment programs, but also, I guess, around this conversation, how that affect what the Chinese mainstream actually care about. So the subjects you're talking about, and people within China caring about their subjects because they have an awareness of them. Kind of when we talk about censorship, more broadly within the country, and kind of within the entertainment industry, it quickly becomes really bizarre, because the kind of it's governed by different things. So it's governed by it's called now SARP, which is a horrific acronym. But they, the things they go after sometimes can be very strange. There had been this huge flowering recently of kind of period dramas in China, and one of them, Yanxi Palace, had great success, and it was kind of being exported overseas, and this is something the Chinese government's talked about wanting to do, and build its soft power overseas. And then someone at SARP, or someone in the party, decided that actually we don't like this image that's being presented of the imperial past, and we don't particularly approve of this. Let's stop these programs, and let's stop this great cultural export. So it's fuzzy and it's bizarre, and it sometimes happens. It doesn't seem to have a coherent thinking behind it, and can often be very counterproductive to things that the government says it wants to do. Do
you have a sense of how annoyed people are about that? Are they annoyed? I mean, if you said, look, we're going to Brexit with no deal, people would be like, oh, I'm not happy about that. If you went, sorry, no more Corrie, it makes the North look crap, right? That would bring them out on the streets.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, Yanxi Palace. I mean, what I would compare Yanxi Palace to is like Downton Abbey. You know, it's like watching Downton Abbey become this huge international brand, and then saying, no, we're not doing that anymore. You know, and what's hilarious is that, you know, I'm sure you remember under the Hu Jintao era, there was this massive push to get Chinese soft power, and we want to be, you know, we all were incredibly jealous of South Korea and how successful South Korea was at exporting its culture. But this is why it doesn't work, because you have some censor in Beijing steps in and says, no, I don't like this. You know.
And do you have any last thought?
No.
Really?
No.
The teenage
when it comes to soft power, not unfortunately to hard power.
I mean, I think it's interesting to look at the creative ways that people try and get around censorship, particularly in China, and kind of the coded terms that come up and stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, we can do that. With the sort of
that's a nice piece of Chinese soft power.
Kind of stuff. Okay, look, thank you very much. Anna's very generously come to speak at the front line without having a book to sell. I don't know when that last happened. But yeah, a round of applause for not having a book to sell, right?
No books here. Thanks.
But James does, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'd be the last person to say you can't come here with a book to sell. But James does, and there's some at the back. And it's sort of surprising, but sort of not surprising that no one did this book before, in a sense. You know, it's like it kind of was a book that should have been written and could have been written at a certain point. Anyway, you end up being the guy that did it, so thank you very much for coming. And thank you very much. I mean, two very succinct speakers who really got points across, and great succinct questions as well. So, and you know, what a night to come out when there were other distractions that could have taken up your time. Yeah, and I think news night starts in a couple of hours, so you're right. So thank you so much for coming, and please thank Anna and James for speaking.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.